The call to Dubai Police Emergency Services came at 4:37 a.m. on February 18, 2020, from a palatial villa in Emirates Hills, one of Dubai's most exclusive gated communities where properties start at $3 million and neighbors include celebrities, diplomats, and royalty. The voice on the line was calm, measured, speaking Arabic with the refined accent of educated Emirati elite. "There's been a terrible accident. Our housemaid has fallen down the stairs. She's not breathing. Please send an ambulance immediately." When paramedics arrived 8 minutes later, they found 26-year-old Jasmine Reyes at the bottom of a marble staircase. Her body twisted at angles that suggested a fall from significant height. But the bruising pattern on her throat told a different story. The defensive wounds on her hands spoke of a struggle. And the 7-month pregnancy that had been carefully hidden beneath loose clothing revealed a motive that would unravel one of Dubai's most prominent families and expose the deadly intersection of wealth, jealousy, and the disposable lives of domestic workers. Standing at the top of those stairs in a silk nightgown that cost more than Jasmine's annual salary was Sheikh Mariam Al-Rashid, 34-year-old wife of Sheikh Hamdan Al-Rashid, whose family's real estate and oil investments made them one of the UAE's wealthiest dynasties. Her hands were trembling. Her story about hearing a fall would change 3 times during police questioning. And the DNA test results in her bathroom drawer would prove that the child Jasmine carried belonged to Mariam's husband, the sheikh who had everything except the ability to keep his marriage vows or protect the women he impregnated. Stay with us because this isn't just about a jealous wife or a cheating husband. This is about a system where domestic workers have fewer rights than the furniture they polish, where powerful families can bury scandals along with bodies, and where a desperate woman from the Philippines became collateral damage in a marriage that was perfect on Instagram but rotting from the inside. The question isn't just how Jasmine Reyes died. It's how many women have to die before we stop treating human beings like property that can be discarded when they become inconvenient. Jasmine Nicole Reyes was born on April 8, 1993, in San Fernando, Pampanga, a province in central Luzon known for its rice fields, its giant lantern festival, and its export of overseas Filipino workers who leave home searching for opportunities that don't exist in a country where college graduates drive tricycles and nurses work as cashiers because there aren't enough jobs to match the surplus of desperate, educated labor. Her family lived in Barangay San Agustin, in a concrete house with a corrugated metal roof that amplified the tropical heat like an oven and turned monsoon rains into deafening percussion that made conversation impossible. Her father, Roberto, worked as a jeepney driver, navigating Manila's chaotic traffic 14 hours daily for earnings that barely covered rice, electricity, and the school fees that represented the family's only pathway out of generational poverty. Her mother, Elena, supplemented their income by taking in laundry and doing alterations for neighbors, her hands perpetually wrinkled from washing and her eyes strained from sewing by inadequate lamplight. They had 4 children, and Jasmine, as the second eldest, carried responsibilities that included caring for her younger siblings while her parents worked, cooking meals from whatever ingredients were affordable, and studying by candlelight during the frequent power outages that plagued their neighborhood. Jasmine was smart but not exceptional, hardworking but not remarkable, the kind of student who earned B grades through effort rather than natural brilliance. She understood early that education alone wouldn't save her family. The Philippines produced millions of college graduates annually, and most of them competed for minimum wage jobs that didn't require degrees or ended up working abroad in positions far below their qualifications. At 17, she watched her older cousin, Maricel, return from Dubai for Christmas vacation carrying gifts that transformed her from struggling OFW into the neighborhood's success story. Maricel had been working as a housemaid for an Emirati family for just 18 months, and she had already sent enough money home to renovate her parents' house, put her younger brother through private high school, and save a small emergency fund that represented security her family had never known. Dubai isn't paradise, Maricel told Jasmine during a conversation that would shape the next decade. You work hard. The heat is unbearable. You miss home every single day. But the money is real, and if you're lucky enough to work for a good family, you can change your entire family's future in just a few years. That conversation planted seeds of calculated desperation. Jasmine finished high school in 2011 with grades good enough for state university but not good enough for scholarships that would make college affordable. She enrolled in a 2-year vocational program for caregiving and household management, training specifically designed to prepare Filipino women for domestic work in Gulf countries where demand for English-speaking housemaids exceeded supply. The program covered basic Arabic, childcare, elderly care, cooking, and the cultural protocols required to work in Muslim households where religious practices and gender dynamics differed dramatically from Catholic Philippines. Jasmine learned to pray 5 times daily, to prepare modest Middle Eastern meals, to navigate households where she would be expected to remain invisible except when her labor was needed. In 2013, at 20 years old, Jasmine registered with an overseas employment agency specializing in Gulf placements. The process was lengthy and expensive: medical exams, psychological evaluations, skills assessments, passport processing, and agency fees that totaled approximately 80,000 pesos, roughly $1,600. Her family borrowed from relatives and informal lenders, creating debt that transformed Jasmine's employment from personal opportunity into family obligation. The weight of that debt was both financial and moral. She wasn't just working for herself. She was carrying her family's hopes, her parents' sacrifices, and her siblings' futures on her shoulders. Failure meant not just personal disappointment but family catastrophe, destroying the trust and resources that multiple households had invested in her success. Her first Dubai placement came in August 2013 with an Indian expatriate family in Jumeirah, a professional couple with 2 young children who treated Jasmine with reasonable kindness but worked her relentlessly. She woke at 5 a.m. to prepare breakfast, cleaned a 4-bedroom villa that accumulated dust with supernatural speed in Dubai's desert climate, managed 2 energetic children, prepared 3 meals daily, and collapsed into her small room at 10 p.m. with barely enough energy to video call her family before exhausted sleep. Her salary was 1,200 dirhams monthly, approximately $325. A pittance by Dubai standards, but more than her father earned in the Philippines. She sent 1,000 dirhams home each month, living on the remaining 200 for personal necessities, cell phone credit, and the small indulgences that made her isolation bearable. For 3 years, Jasmine maintained this routine with the discipline of someone who understood that complaining was a luxury she couldn't afford. She renewed her contract twice, built a reputation as a reliable worker, and accumulated experience that made her eligible for better-paying positions with wealthier families who demanded higher skills and offered marginally better conditions. In December 2016, the agency contacted her about a premium placement, a prominent Emirati family seeking an experienced housemaid for their Emirates Hills villa. The salary was 2,500 dirhams monthly, nearly $700, more than double her current earnings. The family had excellent reputation among agency staff. The villa was spectacular, and the position included private accommodations, regular time off, and the kind of working conditions that most domestic workers could only dream about. Jasmine accepted the position with cautious optimism. She understood that wealthy families could be demanding and that Emirati households came with cultural complexities that required careful navigation. But the salary increase meant she could send more money home, potentially pay off her family's debts within 2 years, and save enough for her own small business when she eventually returned to the Philippines. On January 15, 2017, Jasmine moved into the Al-Rashids family villa, a 12,000-square-foot palace of marble and gold where the monthly electricity bill exceeded what her father earned annually. She met Sheikh Mariam, who was elegant and imperious, and Sheikh Hamdan, who was charming and attentive in ways that made Jasmine slightly uncomfortable. They had 2 children, a son, Khalid, aged 6, and a daughter, Noura, aged 4, who would become Jasmine's primary responsibility and eventually her deepest attachment in a household that would transform from dream job to nightmare. She had no way of knowing that the marble floors she had dreamed of would eventually be stained with her blood, or that the family she would serve faithfully for 3 years would ultimately view her not as a human being but as a problem that required permanent elimination. Sheikh Hamdan Muhammad al-Rashid was born in 1983 into the kind of wealth that makes ambition optional and accountability laughable. His grandfather had been among the first Emiratis to recognize oil's transformative potential in the 1960s, positioning the family to benefit from the resource boom that would turn desert sheikdoms into modern city-states. By the time Hamdan reached adulthood, the family's portfolio included commercial real estate, hotel investments, and construction companies that built the towers reshaping Dubai's skyline. At 37 in 2020, Hamdan represented Dubai's modern elite, Oxford-educated, internationally traveled, fluent in English and Arabic, comfortable in both traditional Kandura and Italian suits. His Instagram account showed a life of supercars, private jets, and philanthropic activities that burnished his reputation as a progressive young leader committed to UAE's development and modernization. But beneath this curated public image lived a man whose sense of entitlement extended to viewing women as acquisitions rather than autonomous beings. His marriage to Mariam in 2010 had been arranged through family connections, a union that joined two prominent families and consolidated wealth rather than celebrating love. The marriage produced 2 children and countless photographs of apparent happiness, but no actual intimacy or partnership. Hamdan's affairs were numerous and systematic. He maintained at least 3 ongoing relationships with women who lived in apartments he rented throughout Dubai, a Russian model in Dubai Marina, a Lebanese television presenter in Business Bay, and a British financial consultant in downtown. Each believed she was his primary extramarital relationship. None knew about the others or about the rotating series of shorter affairs with women who caught his attention temporarily before being discarded. His relationships with household staff followed a particularly predatory pattern. The isolation and dependency of domestic workers made them vulnerable to advances that combined genuine charm with implicit threats about employment and visa status. Hamdan had learned that kindness followed by attention followed by calculated seduction could overcome most resistance, especially from women whose families depended on their employment. Previous maids had left the Al-Rashid household under various pretexts: family emergencies that required immediate return to Philippines, better opportunities elsewhere in UAE, or simply disappearing with severance payments and non-disclosure agreements that bought their silence about why they actually left. The agency that supplied the Al-Rashids had noted this pattern of unusual turnover but continued providing placements because the family's prominence and prompt payments made them too valuable to question. Hamdan's interest in Jasmine began almost immediately after she joined the household in January 2017. Unlike his wife's cold perfectionism or his children's demanding needs, Jasmine brought warmth and genuine care to her work. She sang while cleaning, played creatively with the children, and maintained cheerful competence even during the villa's most chaotic moments. His initial kindness was strategic. He asked about her family, remembered details from previous conversations, and offered assistance with visa paperwork and small financial loans when she mentioned her father's medical expenses. This carefully constructed rapport created gratitude and obligation that would make later advances more difficult to refuse. The children adored Jasmine in ways that highlighted Mariam's emotional distance from her own offspring. Khalid and Noura sought Jasmine for comfort when hurt, for play when bored, and for the maternal warmth their biological mother seemed incapable of providing. This attachment was both Jasmine's greatest professional success and the seed of Mariam's growing resentment. Mariam noticed everything. She observed how her husband's eyes followed Jasmine through rooms, how he found excuses to be present during her work hours, how his generosity toward the maid exceeded normal employer courtesy. But Mariam's response to these observations wasn't immediate confrontation. Instead, she began documenting patterns, gathering evidence, and preparing for a confrontation she hoped would never be necessary but suspected was inevitable. The affair between Sheikh Hamdan and Jasmine Reyes didn't begin with physical seduction. It started with emotional manipulation so gradual that Jasmine couldn't identify the moment when employer courtesy transformed into something more dangerous and forbidden. Throughout 2017 and 2018, Hamdan maintained careful boundaries while simultaneously eroding them through incremental violations. A hand on her shoulder when offering encouragement, sitting unnecessarily close during discussions about the children, compliments about her appearance delivered in ways that felt inappropriate but were subtle enough to dismiss as cultural misunderstanding. By 2019, his advances became less ambiguous. During Mariam's frequent trips to Abu Dhabi to visit family or to London for shopping expeditions, Hamdan's behavior shifted dramatically. He would appear in areas of the villa where Jasmine worked, initiating conversations that lasted longer than necessary. He began gifting her items that exceeded employer generosity: expensive perfumes, jewelry, designer accessories. each gift creating debt and obligation that tightened his control. Jasmine's resistance to these advances was genuine but ultimately futile. She understood the power dynamic clearly. He controlled her visa, her employment, her housing, and her ability to send money home to family members whose survival depended on her continued employment. Refusing his attention too directly risked the catastrophic consequences of unemployment and deportation. In June 2019, the relationship became physical during one of Mariam's extended absences. Hamdan had called Jasmine to his private office ostensibly to discuss Khalid's upcoming school enrollment. The conversation was legitimate, but after concluding the business discussion, Hamdan touched her hand with an intimacy that crossed boundaries Jasmine had tried to maintain. "You're not just our employee," he said softly. "You're family. You care for my children better than anyone. I want you to understand how valuable you are, how much I appreciate everything you do." The kiss that followed wasn't violent or forced. It was calculated seduction that had been prepared through 2 years of emotional manipulation, financial assistance, and the creation of dependency that made rejection feel impossible. Jasmine didn't want this relationship, but she also didn't know how to refuse without destroying everything she had built. Over the following months, their affair continued whenever Mariam was absent from the villa. Hamdan was careful to avoid patterns that might expose them. He never brought Jasmine to hotels or public locations. Their encounters occurred in the villa's private spaces, his office, the gym, occasionally Jasmine's small quarters when household staff were dismissed for the day. For Jasmine, the relationship was a source of constant shame and fear. She prayed for forgiveness in the Catholic prayers she whispered at night. She avoided eye contact with Mariam, terrified that guilt would be visible in her face. She sent more money home than ever before. Hamdan had increased her salary to 4,000 dirhams monthly without Mariam's knowledge, but the financial security felt tainted by the method of its acquisition. The pregnancy that would ultimately seal her fate occurred in October 2019. Jasmine missed her period, then missed the second, before finally purchasing a pregnancy test during her weekly day off. The 2 pink lines appeared with devastating clarity, confirming what she had been dreading for weeks. Her first instinct was termination. The pregnancy was illegal, dangerous to her employment, and morally devastating for someone whose Catholic faith viewed abortion as mortal sin. But abortion was also illegal in UAE except in extreme medical circumstances, and the underground options were expensive and risky. When she told Hamdan about the pregnancy in early November 2019, his response revealed his character completely. He asked immediately whether she was certain the child was his, a question that wounded her deeply since he was her only sexual partner ever. His second question was about her plans for handling the situation, making clear that this was her problem to solve rather than their shared responsibility. Hamdan's solution was clinical and cruel. He provided 20,000 dirhams for either termination or for her to quietly leave UAE, return to Philippines, and have the child there with financial support continuing for limited duration. He made explicit that keeping the pregnancy and remaining in Dubai was not an option he would tolerate or support. Jasmine couldn't bring herself to terminate the pregnancy. Despite the circumstances of conception, the child was innocent and her Catholic faith forbade destroying it. But she also couldn't bring herself to leave Dubai and return home pregnant and unemployed, destroying her family's financial stability and her own reputation in a culture that viewed unwed motherhood as profound shame. Her decision to continue the pregnancy in secret was neither rational nor sustainable. She hid her growing belly beneath increasingly loose clothing, claimed stomach problems to explain nausea, and avoided any activities that might reveal her condition. She told herself she would figure out a solution before the pregnancy became impossible to hide. Perhaps finding a way to leave Dubai in her 3rd trimester, perhaps finding an adoption solution, perhaps experiencing some miracle that would resolve the impossible situation. What she couldn't have predicted was that Mariam Al-Rashid already suspected the affair and had been gathering evidence for months. The final proof would come through a DNA test that would transform suspicion into certainty and trigger the murderous rage that would end with Jasmine's body at the bottom of marble stairs. Sheikh Mariam bint Abdullah Al-Rashid was born in 1986 into privilege that came with suffocating expectations. Her father was a government minister, her mother descended from the royal family, and her entire life had been preparation for a marriage that would elevate her family's status, while requiring her to accept infidelity as the inevitable price of marrying a wealthy man in a culture where male sexual freedom was quietly tolerated, while female virtue was ruthlessly enforced. Her marriage to Hamdan in 2010 had been arranged through family negotiations that resembled corporate mergers more than romantic unions. She was 24 and beautiful, educated at American University in Dubai but with no career aspirations because women of her class didn't work. They managed households, raised children, and maintained social status through carefully curated public appearances. The first years of marriage had been tolerable if not fulfilling. Hamdan was attentive enough during the children's infancy, and Mariam busied herself with motherhood, interior decoration, and the social obligations that came with being a sheikh's wife. But by 2015, Hamdan's infidelities had become obvious to everyone except perhaps Mariam herself, who chose willful ignorance over confronting realities that would require action she wasn't prepared to take. Divorce in their social circle was possible but devastating. Divorced women lost status, faced restricted access to their children, and often found themselves financially dependent on families who viewed their failed marriages as personal shame. Mariam had witnessed friends navigate this destruction, and she had resolved to tolerate Hamdan's affairs as long as they remained discreet and didn't produce complications that threatened her position. The affairs with Russian models and Lebanese presenters were almost acceptable. They occurred outside the household, involved women Mariam would never encounter socially, and represented the kind of male indulgence that her mother and aunts had quietly accepted in their own marriages. But an affair with a housemaid within her own home represented a violation that Mariam couldn't ignore or rationalize away. Her suspicions about Jasmine began in mid-2019 when she noticed subtle changes in the household dynamics. Hamdan's unusual presence at home during times he would normally be at his office. The children's excessive attachment to Jasmine, calling for her rather than their own mother during nighttime fears. And most damning, the salary increase that appeared in household accounts. 4,000 dirhams for a housemaid when 2,500 was already generous. Mariam's initial investigation was methodical. She reviewed credit card statements and found purchases of jewelry and perfumes charged to household accounts but never given to her. She checked villa security footage and saw Hamdan entering Jasmine's quarters during periods when other staff were dismissed. Most devastatingly, she discovered WhatsApp messages on an old phone Hamdan had carelessly left in a bathroom drawer. Messages that confirmed not just an affair but an ongoing relationship with troubling intimacy. The pregnancy discovery came accidentally in January 2020. Mariam had asked Jasmine to bring something from her quarters, and when the maid took longer than expected, Mariam went to investigate. She found Jasmine bent over a sink, experiencing severe morning sickness, and in that moment of vulnerable illness, the careful clothing couldn't hide the subtle swelling of early pregnancy. Mariam said nothing immediately. Instead, she began gathering DNA evidence with meticulous precision. She collected hair samples from Jasmine's brush, tissue samples from Hamdan's razor, and when Jasmine was out on her weekly day off, Mariam searched her quarters thoroughly, finding prenatal vitamins hidden in a drawer and pregnancy test results tucked into a religious book. The DNA test was conducted through a private laboratory that guaranteed discretion for wealthy clients seeking sensitive analysis. Mariam submitted samples labeled only with numbers, paying in cash to avoid traceable records. She told herself she was seeking proof that would allow her to confront Hamdan and demand Jasmine's immediate dismissal and deportation. The results arrived on February 14, 2020, Valentine's Day, a timing so ironic it felt like cosmic mockery. The laboratory confirmed with 99.97% certainty that Hamdan was the biological father of the child Jasmine carried. The proof was absolute, undeniable, and for Mariam, the final destruction of any illusion that her marriage contained anything resembling respect or fidelity. Her response to this confirmation wasn't immediately murderous. For 4 days, she calculated options with the same methodical precision she had applied to gathering evidence. She could confront Hamdan and demand Jasmine's deportation, but pregnant women leaving UAE might raise questions about the child's paternity. She could arrange a quiet payment and secure Jasmine's voluntary departure, but that required trusting that a desperate woman wouldn't return with blackmail demands. Or she could eliminate the problem permanently in a way that would appear accidental, require no explanations, and remove both the affair and the illegitimate child from existence without complicated negotiations or lingering threats. For a woman raised in privilege where consequences rarely reached the powerful, this option began to seem not just possible but necessary. On February 17, 2020, Mariam made her decision. She dismissed all other household staff for the evening, claiming she wanted a quiet night at home with just family. Hamdan was in Abu Dhabi for business, not expected to return until the following day. The children were sleeping in their rooms on the villa's second floor, and Jasmine was folding laundry in the ground floor service area, unaware that she had less than 12 hours left to live. The evening of February 17, 2020, proceeded with deceptive normalcy. Jasmine prepared dinner for Sheikh, Mariam, and the children, grilled hamar fish with saffron rice and a salad that represented Mariam's perpetual diet. After dinner, she supervised the children's bath time, read them bedtime stories in her quarters where they giggled at her animated voices, and settled them in their beds with prayers she whispered in Tagalog that asked God to protect innocent children from the sins of adults. By 10 p.m., the villa was quiet except for the perpetual hum of air conditioning fighting against February's mild heat. Jasmine returned to the ground floor to complete her final duties, folding the laundry she had washed earlier, preparing the breakfast table settings for the next morning, and doing the light cleaning that maintained the villa's showroom perfection. Mariam watched from the second-floor landing, her mind cycling through justifications that transformed murder into acceptable action. Jasmine had seduced her husband. Jasmine was carrying a bastard child that would humiliate the family. Jasmine represented an ongoing threat that required permanent elimination. Each rationalization built upon the previous one until the enormity of what she was planning felt not just justified but necessary. At 11:47 p.m., Mariam descended the stairs and asked Jasmine to bring fresh towels to the master bathroom on the second floor. The request was normal enough. Mariam frequently made last-minute demands that extended Jasmine's workday well past reasonable hours. Jasmine collected the requested towels from the linen closet and began ascending the grand marble staircase that curved elegantly from the ground floor to the second-floor landing. What happened next would be disputed during the trial, but physical evidence and security footage provided undeniable clarity. Mariam waited at the top of the stairs until Jasmine reached the final steps, then grabbed her from behind with force that suggested rage rather than calculation. Jasmine, startled and off-balance from her pregnancy, dropped the towels and grabbed at the railing to prevent falling. The struggle that followed lasted approximately 90 seconds. Mariam's hands went to Jasmine's throat, choking with a strength born from murderous determination and perhaps the adrenaline of breaking through a lifetime of controlled behavior. Jasmine fought back desperately, scratching at Mariam's hands and face, creating defensive wounds that would later prove the death wasn't accidental. "You thought you could steal my husband?" Mariam hissed in Arabic, her voice trembling with fury. "You thought you could have his child while living in my house, eating my food, touching my children?" Jasmine couldn't respond. The hands crushing her windpipe made speech impossible. Her vision began darkening, her struggles weakening as oxygen deprivation took effect. In those final moments of consciousness, she thought not of Hamdan or Mariam or even herself, but of her daughter Noura, who would wake tomorrow asking for 8 Jasmine, and would never understand why her favorite person had disappeared. When Jasmine's body went limp, Mariam released her grip and watched the maid crumple onto the landing. For several minutes, Mariam stood frozen, processing what she had done. The irreversible transformation from Sheikh's wife into murderer, from victim of infidelity into perpetrator of killing. The staging that followed was hasty and poorly executed. Mariam dragged Jasmine's unconscious body to the top of the stairs and pushed it down the marble steps, hoping to create injuries consistent with an accidental fall. The body tumbled down 15 stairs, hitting marble with sickening thuds that Mariam prayed the children wouldn't hear through their closed bedroom doors. But bodies don't fall naturally the same way they fall when pushed, and forensic experts would later identify the inconsistencies. The bruising pattern on Jasmine's throat from manual strangulation couldn't be explained by falling. The defensive wounds on her hands suggested she had fought an attacker, and the location of impact injuries didn't match the trajectory of someone tripping and falling forward. They matched someone whose already unconscious body had been thrown downstairs to simulate an accident. At 4:37 a.m., after spending nearly 5 hours staging the scene and rehearsing her story, Mariam finally called emergency services. Her voice on the recorded call was eerily calm, reporting an accident with practiced emotion that felt performed rather than genuine. When paramedics arrived 8 minutes later, they found Jasmine's body cold and stiff with rigor mortis. She had been dead for hours before anyone sought help. The initial police response treated the death as a probable accident. Maids falling downstairs wasn't uncommon in Dubai's domestic worker community. Exhaustion, inadequate footwear, and rushed tasks created legitimate accidents with tragic frequency. But the responding officer, a Filipino Emirati woman named Lieutenant Aisha Gomez, noticed inconsistencies that triggered deeper investigation. The bruising on Jasmine's throat, the defensive wounds, the suspicious delay between death and the emergency call. And most damning, the security camera footage that showed Mariam waiting at the top of the stairs and showed no footage of Jasmine actually falling, because the cameras had been deactivated for a 40-minute period around midnight, something only someone with system access could have done. Within 12 hours, what began as an accidental death investigation transformed into a homicide case that would expose one of Dubai's wealthiest families and force uncomfortable conversations about the disposable lives of domestic workers in Gulf countries. The arrest of Sheikh Mariam Al-Rashid on February 20, 2020, sent shockwaves through Dubai's elite community. Women of her status didn't get arrested, they settled problems through lawyers, family influence, and the kind of immunity that wealth provided. But the evidence was overwhelming. The victim was a foreign national whose country's embassy demanded justice. And most importantly, Lieutenant Gomez refused to be pressured into treating this as anything other than what it was: cold-blooded murder. The Dubai police investigation uncovered the DNA test results in Mariam's possession, proving her knowledge of Jasmine's pregnancy and establishing clear motive. They recovered the security footage showing Mariam waiting at the stairs. They documented the defensive wounds and manual strangulation evidence. And perhaps most compelling, they obtained testimony from other household staff who described Mariam's increasingly hostile behavior toward Jasmine in the weeks before her death. Sheikh Hamdan's position was precarious and cowardly. He initially denied any affair with Jasmine, claiming the DNA test was fabricated or that she had seduced him during a moment of weakness. But forensic evidence from his phone and laptop revealed months of messages and photographs that proved an ongoing relationship. Confronted with undeniable proof, he admitted the affair but portrayed himself as the victim of an opportunistic maid who had trapped him with pregnancy. The trial began in September 2020 and lasted 11 weeks. Prosecutors charged Mariam with premeditated murder, arguing that the DNA test results showed she had knowledge and time to plan the killing. They presented the security footage, the forensic evidence, and testimony from Filipino domestic workers who described Mariam's cruelty and the fear that pervaded the Al-Rashid household. Mariam's defense team, comprised of some of Dubai's most expensive lawyers, pursued a strategy of temporary insanity and extreme emotional disturbance. They argued that discovering her husband's affair and the pregnancy had created a psychological break that impaired her judgment and reduced her culpability. They presented expert testimony about the cultural shame and trauma associated with infidelity in traditional families, attempting to create sympathy for Mariam as another victim of Hamdan's predatory behavior. The defense's most controversial argument was that Jasmine bore responsibility for her own death through her participation in the affair. They portrayed her as a seductress who had deliberately targeted a vulnerable married man, using her position in the household to create intimacy and ultimately trap him with pregnancy. This victim-blaming strategy enraged Filipino advocacy groups and exposed the deep prejudices about domestic workers that pervaded even progressive Dubai. Hamdan testified reluctantly, admitting the affair but minimizing his role and responsibility. He claimed Jasmine had pursued him, that he had tried to maintain boundaries, and that the pregnancy had surprised him as much as it devastated his wife. His testimony was self-serving and contradicted by evidence, but it reflected the entitlement that allowed him to view himself as victim rather than perpetrator. The most powerful testimony came from Jasmine's mother, Elena, who traveled to Dubai for the trial despite her terror of flying and her limited English. Through a Tagalog interpreter, she described her daughter's character, her dedication to family, her faith, and her dreams that had ended on marble stairs in a house where she had worked faithfully for 3 years. "My daughter was not a bad woman," Elena testified through tears. "She was a good girl who worked hard to help her family. She never wanted to hurt anyone. If she made mistakes, she deserved to face consequences, maybe to lose her job. But she did not deserve to die. She did not deserve to have her child die with her." The verdict, delivered on November 18, 2020, found Mariam guilty of second-degree murder rather than first-degree, acknowledging the extreme emotional circumstances while rejecting claims of temporary insanity. She was sentenced to 18 years in Dubai Central Prison, with the possibility of deportation after serving the full sentence. A compromise that satisfied no one but reflected the court's attempt to balance justice with the family's status. Hamdan faced no criminal charges, but paid 3 million dirhams in blood money to Jasmine's family as required by UAE law. His reputation was destroyed, his marriage ended in divorce, and his children grew up knowing their father's infidelity had led to a woman's murder. The Al-Rashid family's business suffered as international partners distanced themselves from the scandal. Jasmine's family used the blood money to pay off debts, purchase a small house, and establish an education fund for her siblings. But no amount of money could replace the daughter and sister they lost, or the grandchild who died with her, or the future that ended at the bottom of marble stairs in a villa where her life was valued less than the furniture she polished. The aftermath of Jasmine Reyes's murder forced uncomfortable conversations about the kafala sponsorship system that governs migrant workers in Gulf countries. Under this system, workers' visa status is tied to their employer, creating power imbalances that enable exploitation, abuse, and in Jasmine's case, murder without consequence until physical evidence made denial impossible. The Philippines government demanded reforms to protect overseas Filipino workers, threatening to suspend deployment to UAE if conditions didn't improve. Dubai authorities implemented new regulations requiring domestic workers to have direct access to police and embassy officials, prohibiting passport confiscation, and mandating regular welfare checks for workers in private households. But enforcement of these reforms remained weak and inconsistent. Domestic workers continued facing abuse, employers continued escaping accountability, and the fundamental power imbalance that had killed Jasmine persisted because economic desperation in sending countries exceeded labor protections in receiving countries. Lieutenant Aisha Gomez, the Filipino Emirati officer who had refused to dismiss Jasmine's death as an accident, received both commendation and criticism. Her superiors praised her investigative thoroughness while quietly suggesting that such zealous pursuit of prominent families created unnecessary complications. She eventually left the police force and now works with NGOs supporting migrant worker rights, her career sacrificed to principles that the system claimed to value but actually punished. Sheikh Hamdan remarried in 2022 to a woman from another prominent family, his scandal quietly forgotten by the social circle that had briefly pretended to be shocked. He hired another Filipina housemaid, this time a woman in her 50s who was considered too old to be a temptation. A hiring decision that revealed his complete failure to understand that the problem wasn't Jasmine's attractiveness but his own predatory entitlement. Mariam remains in Dubai Central Prison, where she is reportedly a model prisoner who maintains her innocence while simultaneously expressing remorse for what she describes as a momentary loss of control. She receives regular visits from her children, who are being raised by her parents, and from supporters who view her as a victim of her husband's betrayal rather than a murderer who chose violence over the countless non-lethal options available to a wealthy woman with resources and connections. The villa in Emirates Hills was sold in 2021, with real estate agents carefully avoiding mention of the death that occurred there. The new owners renovated extensively, replacing the marble stairs where Jasmine died and attempting to erase the memory of tragedy from a house that had been built to showcase success, but had ultimately revealed the moral rot beneath Dubai's gleaming surface. Jasmine's family erected a memorial in their Pampanga barangay, a simple marker with her photograph, the dates of her too short life, and a prayer in Tagalog that asks God to protect all OFWs working far from home in places where their lives have less value than the labor they provide. Subscribe if you believe these stories matter, because Jasmine's death won't mean anything unless it prevents the next tragedy. Share this with someone who needs to understand that behind every domestic worker is a human being with dreams, dignity, and families who love them. And remember, A system that treats people as disposable will eventually dispose of someone you care about. Justice isn't just for the wealthy, it's for everyone, or it's not justice at all.